Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, Assistant Sports Editor for Multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined for our weekly Penn State podcast here on the Post-Gazette PSU YouTube channel by Isaiah Maldonado, our daily Collegian and Post-Gazette Nittany Lions insider. Excited to talk. Well, am I excited to talk? I don't know about the Penn State loss to UCLA that has a lot of people angry, a lot of people concerned about the state of the program. So we're going to dig into all of that. Before we do, just want to remind you that this show is brought to you by FanDuel. Isaiah, obviously there is more heat on James Franklin than ever this week. It's hard to argue that it's unwarranted given the expectations going into the season. And it's hard to imagine that there's much that can change the situation by the end of the year. Penn State probably can't fire him with the buyout. He doesn't seem to have much incentive to leave. Is there any way out of this toxicity for Penn State short of running the table, making the playoff, making a deep run?
Man, when it comes, I'll touch on the James Franklin point first. Unless they want to try and run up those alumni donations, they're not paying the, I believe, $56 million buyout. It's either 56 or 54, but whatever the case may be, it's an exorbitant amount of money. I think based off of the success that he's had at Penn State in the past, that his job, even though to a lot of people and to me included, probably should be on the hot seat, he's probably got a little bit more time to be able to just solidify himself within that role. So I think in terms of his future with Penn State, that's not too much at jeopardy as of currently standing because of his contract. But in terms of turning the season around, it's rough, man. There's not a lot of quality wins aside from Ohio State that could really boost this team up. Obviously, Indiana's number 7 in the country right now. We kind of have to gauge and see how they're going to do for the rest of the season. There's a chance they drop if they, suffer some losses in Big Ten play. Ohio State is that game that has the opportunity to bring them back in. And even then, it's going to be rough. They have to win out the rest of the season in order to confidently be able to say that they're going to make the college football playoffs. I don't see a 9-3 team making it unless a lot of other teams have a very similar season to Penn State where they lose to a completely opponent that they completely outmatch. So in terms of what they have to do, I mean, it's clear you have to let this be the one bad stretch of the season, and you have to show everybody in the country that that's all that was, that this is still an elite level team, that this is still a team that is worthy of that number 2 ranking in the preseason, and that they have the pieces to make that run. It's evident that in terms of talent from top to bottom, this is definitely a top 25 team. And we have to say top 25 because now they're unranked for the first time since 2022. But there is no question that the pressure is on to win out. That is the only way I can confidently say that they will make the college football playoffs and be able to eliminate a lot of the negative stigma that came with this UCLA loss. It was a grueling loss to be able to lose to a winless team, to have a winless team beat a top 10 AP opponent for the first time since 1985. That's rough. That's something that's going to stick with a lot of voters moving forward unless Penn State really shows everybody that they're a force to be reckoned with.
Well, and I think in terms of James Franklin and the expectations, look, I think he gets tagged with his record at Penn State over a lot of different seasons. There should have been no expectation that he would beat top 10 teams consistently. When he took this job in 2014, when the program was still under sanctions, when it was recovering from that, its recovery was miraculous to come back and win the Big Ten in 2016. He did beat those teams, in that year. And then I believe Penn State probably overperformed a significant amount, institutionally speaking. I was tweeting about this a little bit. Took the weekend to think before really weighing in on the loss and where Penn State stands. But there's been a lot of institutional opposition to doing the things that Penn State needs to do to be at a national championship level. And I think James Franklin did a lot to make people think Penn State institutionally was on that level, regardless of who the coach. What is the support level of the donors? What is the buy-in of the administrators? Those are always the first 2 questions, especially as you move into this highly monetized NIL era where you have to buy players, you have to buy staff. This is not the college football of 5 years ago, so you can't necessarily, I think, look back at that period of time when Penn State didn't have that level of support and say, well, James Franklin's never been able to win the big game. There's reasons for it, and a lot of them are Penn State's fault beyond him. That said, Penn State has started to scale up those resources and those that buy-in from donors over the last 3 years. I think NIL has done a lot to unlock. We talk a lot about how Penn State has more CEO graduates than any school in the country, and those were not the types of guys that wanted to show up at a Waffle House with a bunch of money in an envelope to hand to a 19-year-old kid 5 years ago. And that's why a lot of these schools had relied on that next level of rich guy in terms of your car dealership owners and but not like the Wall Street CEO types. Well, now Penn State's starting to get that money in, and I do think institutionally belongs on a level with Ohio State and Michigan. So the question becomes, are James Franklin's results good enough in that context? And I just can't imagine, if you look at the last 3 years of Penn State losing every single big game with their 5-star recruited quarterback, with two of the greatest running backs that they've ever had, with these defenses that until the last 2 games have been incredibly dominant, that you haven't been able to get over that hump at all. I don't think it's unfair to hold James Franklin accountable for that period of time, regardless of what the overall record is. I've been a supporter of his. I do believe that he's done a lot of good things for Penn State, but it's fair to question, can you get Penn State to the next level in this era of college football? I don't know. Any thoughts on that, Isaiah? I guess specifically this smaller period of time and why it seems more frustrating than maybe everything that came before it.
I think it's frustrating now because we're looking at it from the perspective of it was only the big games before with James Franklin. When it came to facing opponents that they were supposed to beat, they routinely got the job done. This loss to UCLA, I feel, has kind of started a shift in the culture for Penn State in terms of how people view them and what they're able to accomplish. We knew going forward that they were always going to have a rough time dealing with those top 10 teams. And like you mentioned in the past, a lot of the times they weren't necessarily the clear favorite to win that game. It's much more of a 50-50, potentially underdog situation. But now that you mentioned that we're in this heavy NIL era where buying players is key and being able to have that extensive alumni network and have that very, very expansive donor background, that's enticing players to come here. So when you have that level of attention on a program and the resources to attract those recruits, now it's a matter of what else is there to look at. And I think the UCLA loss only magnified that, because now going forward for the rest of the season, the expectation for Penn State going into UCLA, going into the Rose Bowl, was to dominate. And now that they lost that game, what's going to be the expectation when they play Iowa at 8 p.m. at night on the road? What's the expectation when they play Northwestern at home this weekend? There are so many things from a culture perspective of the fan base, or so many things in terms of, people believe that Penn State are going to be able to beat these opponents, but that's not clear anymore. And I think because it's not clear, and there are a growing number of teams that could potentially pose a threat to Penn State, not because they themselves are that good, but because Penn State seems to be in a flux amidst so much chaos right now, that I think it's only magnified these issues. I do think that the questions have to be figured out. We have to be able to find out what's wrong with Penn State, whether it's a coordinator problem, a coaching problem. It doesn't seem to be a talent problem on paper. There are too many unanswered questions, and those unanswered questions are only going to breed more uncertainty moving forward when they have to go further and further into conference play against even unranked Big Ten teams that have still looked very solid.
Isaiah, I want to talk about Jim Knowles. Look, there were little birdies I was paying attention to all summer about the transition for Penn State to the Jim Knowles defense. A lot of Ohio State fan accounts, some Ohio State people who cover Ohio State, noting that it was not, a primrose path for him at Ohio State, that there were breakdowns, that was part of why Ohio State has not been able to beat Michigan for the last 3 seasons, that, despite winning the national championship, there's still some angst there. And Jim Knowles had a part of that, despite that dominant run to end last season, that his philosophy is a little bit high risk, high reward. And, it takes a little time for his system to get to where it was last year with Ohio State. I think we're seeing some of that with Penn State now, given that, the Oregon game, yes, that defense kept them in it, but they were not able to get the stops at the critical times. UCLA, you give up 40-plus points to a winless team. That's a disaster. Was Jim Knowles the right hire for this team? I think, listen, the guy's very accomplished. He obviously just won the national championship at Ohio State. If you were Penn State 5 years ago, I'd have been thrilled to see Jim Knowles hired as the defensive coordinator. But was he the finishing piece that this Penn State program needed? Because to me, it looks like he could be great long term. End of this 3 years, maybe he does exactly what he did at Ohio State and has a dominant defense, finds the guys he wants. But that's not the situation he was walking into. We weren't talking about a program building towards something. We were talking about a program capable of going out and winning the national championship this season. So to what degree are you questioning that hire now, Isaiah?
I think there's a lot of questions around his scheme if we're talking about, questioning the hire. There's no doubt in my mind that the scheme itself can succeed. We saw it succeed at Ohio State. There's no reason to sit there and say that this scheme is not a winning level defense, a defensive plan for any sort of team. But the question is, now that Penn State is approaching game 6, James Franklin spoke in his presser talking about how the defense isn't necessarily at the level that they had anticipated, whether it's comfortability within the system, people knowing their assignments, people knowing their coverage, people knowing their zones, their responsibilities. That's a problem to have as we approach the halfway mark of college football season for any team, but especially for a team like Penn State that had those national championship aspirations. And all we heard from the players going into the season, and then even very early on in the season when they went 3-0 against non-conference competition, was that this was a defensive scheme that allowed players to play free. It was an NFL-style defense. It was allowing these people, the players on defense, to go out there, have a little bit more freedom with their assignments, make those individual plays, a system that highlighted individual talent more so than just restricting them to covering a specific zone. And though I believe with Penn State's talented defense that on paper it's a good fit, something about it hasn't added up entirely. When we talk about Penn State's run defense against UCLA, it was atrocious. There's really nothing short of it to say. For Nico to be able to run for over 130 yards, 3 touchdowns on the ground, consistently pick apart that defense, I don't necessarily know what I can attribute to on paper. I mean, obviously the long-term Tony Rojas injury was something very serious. Penn State having to fill that gap with Dom DeLuca and have him play a little bit more. Obviously, he split some snaps at both the Mike and Will positions, but they didn't look nearly as comfortable stopping the run. When it came to passing defense, they didn't look terrible, but they just looked a little bit confused out there sometimes. But the biggest problem was the best part of this Penn State defense is the defensive line. So to be able to consistently not be able to stop the run, to have these gaps be breached, to have players unable to get those consistent tackles for loss. And I won't say that they weren't able to get them against UCLA. They did end with 8. They got 3 sacks. They were able to make their presence within the backfield. But when it came to those key plays, those highlight moments at the side of the game that are able to extend runs and allow the Bruins, to get to the end zone and run up the score, they fell short. And whether that was, and it didn't seem to be that big of an issue in terms of the offense being on the field for too short. The offense didn't look bad against UCLA. This was a defensive collapse. We talk about the Oregon loss, but we can sit there and say, they were gassed. Even if they themselves won't admit it, there's no reason they should be on the field for that much time. Penn State shouldn't have that many 3-and-outs. It shouldn't have that many drives at the time of possession was under 2 minutes. But this was a game where Penn State's offense looked relatively solid. I mean, the run game was a little bit questionable, but Drew Allar played very well for all intents and purposes with him. 19 for 26, 73% completion percentage, 200 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, probably his best performance of the season in terms of distributing the ball in the air. But when it comes to the defense, there was no reason for there to be as big of a collapse as there was. And whether this is...
I would disagree, Isaiah. I think the reason is there's a lack of continuity here. from what Penn State has been doing well from Manny Diaz, and I think that's what made the Tom Allen hire, mostly successful, was that a lot of the things that Manny Diaz was doing well, Penn State retained, and it just seems like that is not what's happening here, and that's the reason to me when I watch this, and it makes me wonder. Anthony Poindexter is a guy that's been around for a long time. He was in that conversation for defensive coordinator. Do you do better? Are you better off with continuity, putting someone like that in charge? James Franklin relying on the bench that he's cultivated and saying, I'm going to dance with the guys who brought me here, and here being, the final minute of the Orange Bowl with the chance to go to the national championship game. They are further from that now than they were before. And that, again, doesn't mean, like you said, that the Jim Knowles defense can't be successful with time, but clearly there's a learning curve. Clearly, they didn't anticipate that would take more time. And I just keep coming back to the words finishing piece. Jim Knowles is not that. And to me, unless you're able to salvage this in the next 3 years with recruits jumping ship after some of these losses and all of that, then you've already kind of lost this hire to me. And maybe that's not fair to Jim Knowles, but this was the team you were supposed to do it with. It's not the team in 3 years. This is the group you were supposed to do it with, and they failed them. And I don't think that that's really questionable at this point. Isaiah, obviously everything now rides on the Ohio State game. Do you think that it's a bigger strength that he knows Ohio State's weaknesses as a guy who is intimately familiar with their offense, going against them in practice all the time? Or is it a bigger weakness that Ohio State knows his weaknesses? I would argue it's definitely the latter, considering it's not just Ohio State, clearly, that knows Penn State's weaknesses on defense right now.
I would say I have to agree with you. When we look at this from the perspective of who has the bigger advantage, even if we could confidently say that Jim Knowles is so used to going against that Ohio State defense and he knows them inside and out, I don't think that Penn State, with their offense as currently constructed, how slow they've been to start games and been reliant on that second half and those fourth quarter situations to really come alive. I don't think they have the solidified offense to even take advantage of knowing all of those weaknesses. On the other hand, in terms of those chunk plays, those dynamic pieces on the offensive side of the ball, Julian Sayin has looked very solid. Jeremiah Smith remains as one of the best wide receivers in college football. Carnell Tate has emerged as this by far his best season and continues to show why Ohio State is considered to be wide receiver university. They just continue to pump out elite talent. Not only does Ohio State have the offense to be able to pick apart a defense led by Jim Knowles that Ryan Day is going to know every single thing about, it's not going to be reciprocated on the latter end for Penn State. Penn State does not have the proven firepower and the proven results on the offensive end of the ball consistently from start to end of the game to be able to take advantage of potentially knowing offensive schemes, knowing play calls, know tells to let the opposing defense knows what plays might be run. It seems to be a lot more in favor of Ohio State. And with this game being at home, this is going to be undoubtedly Penn State's toughest game of the season, or at least when it comes to the regular season, if they were able to make it to the college football playoffs. But at this point, that's looking miraculous if they were able to do that.
Isaiah, Drew Allar keeps saying that he scoffed when he was asked the question, are they in the hunt for the playoffs? He said, of course. James Franklin keeps pointing to Ohio State last season when they lost to Michigan. And I've seen it on social media. Even Ohio State fans are cracking jokes that, listen, Penn State lost to Oregon just like Ohio State did last year. They lost to a crappy team. Of course, they're making a joke about Michigan being a crappy team before Ohio State goes on to win the national title. But does anyone in that building actually believe that, you think? Because I can't see – it's not the same situation to me. Ohio State lost that game in a rivalry setting in the last game of the season, last plays of the regular season. And that's not at all comparable to Penn State having had these issues all year. I don't think they're going to stop at 2 losses. And I don't think anyone else – it's not a matter of do you believe that you can get in at 10-2. Absolutely, I think they have the games left on their schedule that if you go 10-2, you could get in. We saw last season it was the 9-3 teams that were sweating that bubble. I would expect it to be similar this year for the same structural reasons. So it's not a question of like, can you make the resume to get in? I think we all agree that they can.
Yes.
But I don't see a lot in common with that Ohio State team a year ago. I don't see a level of demonstrated dominance that just evaporated in a couple of big moments. I see a team that's not very good and could go 8-4 in the regular season, could go 7-5 in the regular season on the trajectory that you're on. When you lose to a winless team that just fired their coach, that just fired their offensive coordinator, that's materially different than what happened for Ohio State and Michigan a year ago.
Absolutely. Penn State was a much more solidified team, or not a more solidified team, but let me rephrase that. They're a team that had a lot of expectations, and they're a team that has consistently not been able to meet those expectations. When we look at the history of Penn State, falling in that big moment is something that's become synonymous with them. And Ohio State, regardless of sometimes struggling to beat Michigan being able to get the upper edge on them, they have been able to routinely give other top competition and top ranked teams amazing fights and to walk out on top of them. And that's the key difference between them. And I think the way they handle adversity in itself is something that is very different. When we look at Penn State, the message has been, let's not let one loss turn into two. And then now after losing to UCLA, it's like, let's not let two losses turn into three. Let's go into this week with that 1-0 mentality. But it hasn't been able to be put into practice. We're still seeing the same problems with Penn State. They're still slow out the gate. They're not able to look efficient, look smooth on the offensive side of the ball. The defense, even in this game, was the main problem was the defense in the first half. 27 first half points by UCLA. That was the problem. So, and that's not typically a problem. So I think that their continuity, their identity has been shaken by these losses. And I'm not seeing much of a bright spot or just like a light in the dark that would point me in the direction to say that, yeah, they're going to be able to learn from these losses. It looks more like everybody's kind of in that state of just confusion, wondering what's going on and trying their best to make something out of nothing. I think the expectations that they had before the season started are weighing heavy on them. I think that they had all the pieces lined up on paper to be one of the best teams in the country. And now that is evidently not the case, they're shaken by it. And going into those tough games, like I mentioned before, Indiana's still on the schedule. Ohio State's obviously on the schedule. Iowa's looked very solid. Northwestern hasn't been terrible. But teams that we could confidently say Penn State was going to beat are no longer those confident wins. So I don't have faith in this program to be able to get rid of that. Don't let two losses turn into three. It's a matter of you guys need to go into every single week completely separate from the week prior. Those losses need to light a fire under you guys, because at this point, like you said, we know a 10-2 team can't make it without much of a problem, especially with two top 10 teams currently still remaining on the schedule if they were able to win out. The question is those 9-3 teams that are going to be struggling to get in, break through that bubble. And what happens if one of those losses are to Indiana or at worst Iowa? Are you going to be able to sit there and say that if you lose to Iowa, you're confident about going into Ohio State on the road and taking down the number one team in the country if that's where they still rank? I don't think that anybody is seriously thinking that Penn State has the opportunity to win out the season.
Yeah, or even, get the wins. If you go 9-3, are you going to get the wins necessary for you to, I don't know, act like Lane Kiffin was last year, or like South Carolina was last year, or like Alabama was last year, saying we deserve to be in at 9-3. Look, we beat these teams. Penn State doesn't have that yet. And I don't know. I guess I just philosophically I'm never going to come around to the idea that you should say Penn State belongs in at 9-3. The way some of those SEC teams shamelessly did last season. Isaiah, if Penn State is going to go on a run here, and they're plus 8,000 to win the Big Ten right now, according to our friends at FanDuel, what needs to change and what does that look like? I guess on offense, does the running game just need to figure it out more consistently? Do you need to cut Drew Allar loose a little bit? Because what do you have to lose with some mistakes at this point? Or does it just come down to this defense has not been a Penn State top 10 caliber defense for 2 weeks, and until it is, there's no reason to take this program seriously?
It's definitely a mix of both. I mean, once again, to your point exactly, what else do you have left to lose with 2 consecutive losses? We've seen Drew Allar be able to make just fantastical plays, be able to show off his arm strength. Cut him loose. Don't wait until the second half, the third and fourth quarter for him to make some of those 40-plus yard bombs. Let him do it in the first quarter. If he throws a pick at this point, whatever. Like, we need to see more from this Penn State offense. I think a lot of it also falls on the offensive line. This was a unit that heading into the season, people expected to be one of the premier offensive lines in all of college football, and they have not been that. Left tackle Drew Shelton spoke a little bit about it, saying that he feels like everybody on the line has to come together more, whether it's 4 people on the line executing everything perfectly, but one person who's lagging behind. That's definitely been a key factor in why this run game hasn't looked as dynamic, as to why they haven't been able to establish themselves as well as they have in the first 3 weeks, and as well as they did in 2024 when they led the Big Ten in rushing. So I think that plays a lot to it. I think Drew Allar needs, with his struggles, he's obviously going to need more time in the pocket. He's going to need to be able to have a straight shot to be able to deliver the ball in the air. Katron and Nick Singleton need those gaps to be widened. They need to be able to get that buildup, get that acceleration, to be able to break away in open space and read the secondary like they've been doing, like they did in the first 3 weeks when they were able to pick apart those defenses because they had the time and the space to operate. And then from a defensive perspective, you just need to avoid a collapse like this. You cannot be challenged on the run. Your defensive line is supposed to be the heart and soul of this defense. Zane Durant, Ford, Xavier, those are the players that need to sit there and be able to make an impact routinely. Amari Campbell has looked very good thus far, and now he's going to need to step it up even more with Tony Rojas being out. Dom LeLuca has been a captain of this team for, I believe, 2 or 3 seasons. He's somebody who's solidified within the rotation. He's somebody who's not only a commendable but a reliable face within the locker room. He's going to need to take a step forward with Rojas out, and everything needs to come together more. That's really all that I can say. There's been too many disconnects on multiple levels for Penn State to be able to make any real run or overturn some of these questions that are presented about them, because they just don't look to be playing as one consistent unit. And that's James Franklin's motto, or that's his message to the team going forward, is that this is not something that we need to pin the loss on somebody specifically. That's not going to help Penn State be able to learn and grow. This has to be a collective effort where everybody is putting in the hours, putting in the time, and really just, I kind of mentioned how I mentioned earlier, that fire needs to be lit under them, and they need to have just a reawakening to really make this season anything close to what the expectations were before it started.
Yeah, I agree. Isaiah, thank you for joining me this week. Everyone else, if you're just joining us for the first time, please subscribe to the channel. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Help us out in the YouTube algorithm. Check out our written work at post-gazette.com. Lots of good stuff coming there from Isaiah. We will be back on Saturday after Penn State Northwestern. Isaiah will have the scoop from Beaver Stadium. So lots to look forward to. Please subscribe, and we will talk to you all again next week.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.